Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me. What I'm going to talk about today this afternoon is at a much lower level of generality, I think, than the discussions this morning. And it's mostly part of a broader project where the sort of normative implications of this, I'm actually going to talk about tomorrow in a subsequent talk, some of that. But this is really about a lot of work that I've done over the years about theories of institutional change and some debates that I've been engaged in about how to go about explaining institutional change. So that's the context. And in a few minutes I will explain this rather abstract sheet of paper. In this talk I focus on a set of social scientific accounts of institutional emergence and change. My primary goal is to illustrate how certain strategic accounts to institutional change can help us distinguish the relative merits of various claims about what explains the rise of neoliberalism institutions. In doing so, I want to lend support to the argument that the most important task in the social sciences is the development of middle-range theories and explanations, which build on an identification of the basic causal mechanisms of social life. The emphasis on social mechanisms owes much of its impetus to the early work of Robert Merton. Merton advocated an approach to social scientific research that adopted a middle ground between grand theorizing and description of specific events. The task was to identify, quote, social processes having designated consequences for designated parts of the social structure. More recent advocates of this middle range approach have given greater specificity to what counts as a social mechanism. Representative of these are the alternative but related definitions offered by Thomas Schelling, quote, a social mechanism is a plausible hypothesis or a set of hypotheses that could be the explanation of some phenomenon, the explanation being in terms of interactions between individuals and some other individuals, or between individuals and some social aggregate. Alternatively, a social mechanism is an interpretation in terms of individual behavior of a model that abstractly reproduces the phenomenon that needs explaining. Now, the motivating idea here is that social mechanisms are the basic building blocks of social processes, and that the goal of explanation should be to identify and account for these underlying mechanisms. Although the focus is on an individual level analysis, a mechanism-based approach is not committed to a rigid methodological individualism. While some advocates of the approach, such as Elster and Gambetta, limit the concept to explanations of individual action, others, such as Boudon and Schelling, extend the concept to include both interactions among social actors and the effects of social institutions. A helpful typology of social mechanisms has been proposed by Henstrom and Svedberg. Building on a scheme developed by James Coleman in the early 1990s, Henstrom and Svedberg identify three types of social mechanisms. The first, situational mechanisms which focus on the effects of social context on individual actors. The second, action formation mechanisms, which focus on, quote, how a specific combination of individual desires, beliefs, and action opportunities generate a specific action, quote. And three, transformational mechanisms which focus on how the interactions of various individuals produce collective outcomes. The common feature of each type of mechanism is that an explanation in terms of social mechanisms requires an account of how the social phenomenon to be explained is related to the actions of individuals. In the analysis of neoliberalism which follows, I'll focus on both type 2 and type 3 mechanisms. A primary focus on social mechanisms entails a more modest project than the traditional claim that the goal of social scientific research is the production of general laws. Much has been written about the strengths and weaknesses of the traditional approach, and I will not rehearse those arguments today. For my purposes, I rest my support for a mechanism-based approach on its practical benefits. Henstrom and Svedberg contrast the practical differences between the two approaches as follows. The covering law model provides justification for the use of black box explanations in the social sciences because it does not stipulate that the mechanism linking the explanans and the explanandum must be specified in order for an acceptable explanation to be at hand. This omission has given leeway for sloppy scholarship, and a major advantage of the mechanism-based approach is that it provides or encourages deeper, more direct, and more fine-grained explanations. The search for generative mechanisms consequently helps us distinguish between genuine causality and coincidental association. It increases the understanding of why we observe what we observe. But now here, it's important to note that the more modest aspirations of the mechanism-based approach does not reduce to ad hoc accounts fitted to particular sets of facts. The mechanism-based approach is beneficial precisely because it focuses our attention on basic mechanisms that are prevalent in a wide variety of social situations. Peterson, for example, incorporates the generality requirement into his definition of a mechanism when he says, quote, specific causal patterns which explain individual actions over a wide range of settings. The task, as I will show in this following analysis, is to identify, 1, the underlying mechanisms, and 2, the social conditions under which these mechanisms are most likely to operate. So now let me say some about sort of an introduction to some of the background material that I use in terms of thinking about the institutional consequences of the emergence of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is obviously a complex phenomenon. It emerged in various parts of the world and involved changes in policies, institutions, and ideas throughout the social, political, and economic spheres. One could thus take various approaches to trying to explain neoliberalism. My focus is going to be on the changes in various political and economic institutions that were fundamental to the neoliberal policy agenda. To ground this analysis in some particular empirical examples, I'm going to concentrate on these institutional changes that occurred during efforts of several Latin American governments to implement neoliberal economic reforms, just to have an empirical focal point to talk about. I want to begin by offering a sketch of sort of the dynamic of institutional development and change during the neoliberal reform period. In doing so, I draw on several accounts of the rise of neoliberalism in Latin America. Although some of the historical particulars differ across the countries that attempted neoliberal reforms, a common picture can be discerned, I think. In the 1970s, authoritarian states played a central role in the management of the economy throughout Latin America. The economy was characterized by substantial public ownership of enterprises, close ties between state bureaucrats and private owners of capital, a significant emphasis on exports as the primary source of economic growth, state policies to protect predominantly export sectors, and social and economic policies that protected consumers and workers. For a time, this state-managed, export-oriented approach fostered significant economic growth. Excuse me. But by the beginning of the next decade, the economic picture had undergone several important changes. Export earnings decreased dramatically, accounting in large part for a subsequent decline in domestic investment. The negative effects of the loss of domestic investment was exacerbated by a decrease in foreign investment due to a credit crisis in the international financial system. Domestically, the drop in economic growth created significant social conflict as people throughout the society faced declines in individual earnings and income. In the face of these tensions, all parties looked to the state to see how it was going to confront the basic problem of how to generate sufficient investment to revive economic growth. It was in the context of these declining economic conditions that governments throughout Latin America began to consider neoliberal economic reforms. The basic goals of these reforms were, in the words of Adam Jaworski, quote, to organize an economy that rationally allocates resources in which the state is financially solvent, unquote. This involved a fundamental transformation of the economic sphere from state-oriented protections, controls, and planning to decentralized market-based economic decision-making. Now, to accomplish this, state officials had to address both short-term and long-term concerns. In regard to the short term, state officials implemented a set of economic stabilization policies, such as currency devaluation and the curtailment of various price control, consumer subsidy, and worker protection programs. These policies in and of themselves had a significant impact on the domestic economies in these countries. But the long-term policies envisioned a fundamental change in basic economic, and in case of these Latin American countries, political institutions. The neoliberal agenda required basic changes in two fundamental aspects of a nation's economic institutional arrangements. The first, the institutional foundations of a market economy had to be established and/or strengthened. This included the following types of changes: the dismantling of state bureaucratic procedures, the liberalization of trade and foreign investment practices, the enhancement of domestic market infrastructure, and the diminution of the power and influence of many private associations, whether they're corporate monopolies, labor unions, consumer associations, etc., each of which had successfully influenced economic policymaking during the state-oriented procedures. Second, the property rights in various sectors previously owned or controlled by the state had to be privatized. While attempting to do all of this, state officials were also trying to shore up the financial status of the state by decreasing public expenditures and increasing government revenues. The sale of publicly owned corporations was an important factor in these latter efforts. Here it's important to note, I think, that the efforts to implement neoliberal economic policies took place at the same time that many of these same countries were undergoing efforts to establish constitutional democracies in the political sphere. By pointing out the simultaneous nature of the political and economic reforms, I don't mean to imply that the neoliberal policies necessarily required democratic political institutions. I take this to be an open and contestable question in terms of the long-run dynamics of the societies. It seems possible that the economic liberalization in Latin America during this period could have occurred without the move towards democracy. But a complex understanding of the institutional changes associated with neoliberalism in Latin America requires us to take account of the fact that political and economic institutions were in fact being transformed at the same time. Furthermore, the Latin American experience suggests that the efforts to implement neoliberal economic changes had significant implications for the attempt to establish a democratic form of public decision-making. Therefore, the changes in the institutions governing public decision-making should serve as a third major aspect of the institutional changes to be explained in the assessment of neoliberalism. The implementation of these neoliberal reforms produced various consequences. Economists and other scholars of Latin America have debated the long-term merits of these reforms, but few would deny that the economic effects of the various policy and institutional changes were substantial. Hyperinflation followed from the initial stabilization policies. This produced significant costs, and the costs were borne disproportionately by some social groups. For example, the capitalists who were in disfavored economic sectors, as well as the working class and the poor. Over time, some countries did experience significant economic growth, but the benefits of that growth continued to be distributed in ways that favored property ownership in certain economic sectors. For my purposes, I want to distinguish the economic consequences of neoliberalism reforms from the institutional consequences. The economic consequences are primarily relevant for this analysis to the extent that they might have engendered a response in terms of changes in political and economic institutions. 4. Although the neoliberal reforms involved substantial institutional changes in the three areas that I'm considering, market institutions, property rights, and democratic decision-making, the economic costs associated with the various economic policy changes produced institutional responses. In response to the political demands generated by these costs, some states backed off of a strict neoliberal plan and re-implemented various controlled and subsidy protection programs. Other states attempted to sustain the basic neoliberal agenda, but they did so at the expense of democratic reforms. State officials developed new institutional procedures for implementing economic policies, seeking to insulate economic policy decision-making from the effects of democratic politics. This dynamic of institutional change associated with neoliberalism in Latin America forms the basis of my analysis of a number of political economy theories of institutions. Scholars of economic policy in Latin America during this period have proposed several explanations of these neoliberal reforms. Their proposals are instructive because they identify various causal factors that might be relevant to a strategic account of these institutional changes. So let me briefly list by highlighting some of the more prominent explanations. I'm just going to list them, and then I will refer back to them again in the end. Now, the economic crisis, each of these are associated with some scholar of Latin America. I won't go through and name them all now, but if you're interested. First, the economic crisis facing the Latin American countries was so severe that political leaders had no choice but to adopt neoliberal reforms. Second, pressure from international financial organizations forced politicians to adopt stabilization policies and neoliberal reforms. Third, Governments implemented radical neoliberal programs because they sought to enhance aggregate economic growth, and the shock strategy was more efficient than more gradual approaches. Fourth, the international diffusion of neoliberal economic ideas reached Latin America at an especially important time and was embraced by government officials. 5. Neoliberal reforms were the product of the state's efforts to further the interests of the capitalist class. 6. In the face of the economic crisis, politicians enacted stabilization adjustment policies early in their terms of office as an electoral strategy to remain in office. And finally, the development of neoliberal reforms were the product of a complex political competition among domestic capitalists. Now, although most of these explanations make no specific reference to sort of strategic decision-making, we can find among the various proposals several factors that might be incorporated in such an account of neoliberal institutional change. A number of explanations treat the neoliberal programs as intentional reform efforts, highlighting the role of preferences in the determination of these changes. Others emphasize the importance of contextual factors, such as international pressure and domestic competition, factors that might influence the choices of political and economic actors. And finally, one proposal emphasizes the importance of the diffusion of ideas, a factor that can influence both the preferences and beliefs of the relevant actors. These various factors constitute claims about the causal processes that govern neoliberal institutional change. Some are compatible and some conflict, but there's very little effort in most of these accounts to assess the relative merits of the different explanations. In the next part of my talk, I'm going to discuss two alternative theories of institutional change. Each theory is grounded in a claim about the primary social mechanisms that generate processes of change. In the course of the discussion, I'm going to delineate the sets of social conditions that make each of these theories plausible accounts of institutional change and highlight the types of empirical evidence we would need to support each theory's claims about the relevant social mechanisms. This analysis of the relationship between the analytical models and the empirical evidence allows us to assess in a particular historical case the relative importance of different social mechanisms that may underlie the process of institutional change. In doing so, I'm going to show how each of these factors proposed in the various accounts of neoliberalism in Latin America is relevant to at least one of the two theories of institutional change that I consider. Okay, now let me talk for a bit about the two theories. And this is an area in which we're going to go back to sort of a theoretical discussion and a debate that I've been involved in for now almost 20 years. About dealing with issues about social institutions and the explanations of how they change and why. The first account is an account which is basically built on transaction cost economics, and it for a long time has been the sort of dominant account of institutional creation and change in the literature in political science and economics. And it's a mix, and I'll talk about it, it's a mix of contract and selection through market competition. And so that's one of the two theories I'm going to talk about. The second is a theory that I'm associated with that is a bargaining theory, which explains the emergence of institutions in terms of the asymmetries of power in a society and the competition and the conflict that takes place over trying to establish various types of institutions. Now, these theories do have some features in common, and that's why I've produced this little handout, I was going to write it up on the board, but then there is no board. I wrote it up on the wall. Everybody would get mad at me, so I'm not going to do that. So I'll just do it. And basically, what this is, let me explain to you what it is. It's purely an analytical model, which I want to try to use to think about the different ways that small n interactions take place in society. Okay, and the important feature is there are two possible strategies for each of the actors. They can choose X or choose Y, and there are four possible outcomes that are a product of them making those choices. The simplest example that's usually used in talking about these sorts of models is you can think about the difference between driving on the left or right-hand side of the road, right? And there's an institutional practice of, in every society, we drive on the left or we drive on the right. The options here, X and Y, could refer to driving on the left or the right, and then there are possible outcomes of everybody driving on the left or everybody driving on the right, both of which are good outcomes. And the bad outcomes are some people driving on the left and some driving on the right, and then vice versa, especially when it comes to hills or trying to go over hills or this sort of thing. Those are very bad outcomes in terms of that. I'll talk about them. But I only mean it as an analytical model, and I'm using it for purposes of trying to elucidate the theories and try to set out the differences and so what they focus on, and I'll use this and come back to it and put some more detail in it soon. Okay. What the model does, it starts from this following premise about the role of institutions in social life. Among other things, it suggests that institutions are rules that structure social interactions in ways that allow social actors to gain the benefits of joint activities. So that they're the rules that help us coordinate behavior in various types of ways for the benefit of everyone. At least that's the argument. In any social situation, there are usually a number of ways that rules could structure these interactions. The process of institutional development culminates in the establishment of one of these rules as the common institutional form in a community. The requirements of the model are straightforward. As I said before, each of the social actors have at least two choices of action. At least two of the outcomes produced by the interdependent choices of the actors are characterized by payoffs, and that's what the A1 and the A's and B's are. There are certain values of joint activity. At least two of the outcomes produced by the interdependent choice of the actors must be characterized by payoffs that incorporate the benefits of joint activity. In both of the theories that I'm going to consider here, these outcomes take the form of equilibria, social equilibria in a sense. That there are at least two strategy combinations that would produce an outcome that the actors would accept as a resolution of the interaction. The task for the actors in the interaction is to find a way to produce one of the social equilibria. In this model, a social institution is a rule of action that would identify and induce compliance with one of these equilibrium strategy combinations. Okay. So I've already suggested that there are four possible outcomes. Both do X, both do Y, or do X and Y, bad outcomes. The payoffs are characterized by the variables. If you want to look at this for a second, I can. Okay. The payoffs are characterized by the variables A and B. Okay? And A1 and A2, A1 refers to the payoffs to player 1, A2 and B2 refer to the payoffs to player 2. Okay. If it's the case that A1, A2, the value of A1, A2 is greater than the value of B1, B2, then there are going to be two social equilibria in the game. Both do X or both do Y. Okay? So that would be the first important feature for this to be a appropriately modeled social interaction of the form that I want to talk about. The strategic problem for the players rests in the fact that without more information about the social context in which the interaction takes place, they do not know on which equilibrium to focus their strategic choice. So, for instance, if I knew that you and I are interacting in this way, and if I knew that what you were going to do is do X, then the thing for me to do would be to do X, because I would benefit from that as opposed to doing Y if I know that's what you're going to do. Okay? But without that information about what you're going to do, then I'm at a bit of a loss. In this situation, two possible institutional rules could emerge, either one that recommends a strategy choice of X or one that recommends a strategy choice of Y. With this simple model, I can illustrate which features of the social interaction that different approaches choose to give primary emphasis. As a shorthand, I'm going to refer to the approaches in terms of the primary social mechanism that underlies the different explanation. I'll refer to the contract approach for the exchange and selection through competition approach, and I'll refer to the bargain approach for the bargaining process and the conflictual analysis. First and foremost, first point to make is that both approaches rely on the assumption that A is greater than B. So it does create the two social equilibria. It's simply a claim that the benefits of living in a world with social institutions can be greater than living in an anarchic world without them. Second, from this initial assumption, the bargaining approach differs from the contract approach in terms of the additional features of the social interaction it emphasizes. The contract approach emphasizes the following relationship, that A1 plus A2 is greater than B1 plus B2. Okay? The contract approach emphasizes that A1 plus A2 is greater than B1 plus B2. This relationship emphasizes the following feature of the outcomes induced by the social institution. The aggregate benefits produced by the rule exceed the aggregate benefits of failing to produce a rule. So it talks about it very much in terms of the collective benefit of having a rule. Okay, and that's why A1 plus A2, the aggregate value, is greater than not having one. The comparison on the contract theory is between social outcomes induced by a social institution and social outcomes without social institutions. This emphasis on the collective gains produced by social institutions is found in explanations that emphasize characteristics such as social efficiency, Pareto superiority, the minimization of transaction costs, etc. The bargaining approach, on the other hand, incorporates directly into the payoffs additional assumptions about the social context in which the social interaction takes place. This approach emphasizes the following relationship. The two equilibria are distinguished by the fact that A1 is greater than A2 in one equilibrium, and A2 is greater than A1 in the other. Okay? The fact that A1 is greater than A2 in one equilibrium, and A2 is greater than A1 in the other. This relationship emphasizes the following feature of the outcomes induced by social institutions. The institutions have distinctive distributional consequences. That is, the institutions affect the distribution of the benefits of joint activity. And the different institutions distribute those benefits in different ways. The bargaining approach shifts the focus from aggregate effects to the effects on the benefits of individual social actors. Here the comparison is between the outcomes induced by the different social institutions. Thus, in seeking to explain how the institutional rule emerges to direct the choices of the actors to either the XX or the YY equilibrium, the two approaches model the basic social interaction somewhat differently. The contract approach emphasizes the A1 plus A2 greater than B1 plus B2 relationship. The bargaining approach gives primary emphasis to the relationship that characterizes the differences in the values of A1 and A2 for the different equilibria. In doing so, this gives primary explanatory emphasis to different features of the social situation out of which social institutions emerge. These features are reflective of the different effects of institutions on social life. The significance of this emphasis should not be underestimated. The choice of emphasis is an important part of the process of interpreting any of these strategic models. The choice represents a substantive claim about what the proponents think are the primary factors relevant to explaining the emergence of social institutions. This emphasis is central to subsequent claims about the importance of social context and about the mechanisms for resolving the strategic problem of multiple equilibria. Just as an aside, you see, as I suggested, the transaction cost approach has been the dominant approach in terms of thinking about institutional change in the political economy field. And so the emphasis has been on the resolution of collective action problems or the resolution of coordination problems. The emphasis is being placed on the joint benefits, the collective benefits that institutions provide, and generating explanations of institutional emergence and change from those joint benefits. So a little biographical aside, when I was a graduate student and I was learning this various types of literature, I thought that there was something, at the very least, somewhat significantly incomplete about these theories. And what was incomplete about them was that there was an enormous amount of conflict and competition that went on in explaining the emergence of social institutions and also how they changed over time. And I thought that conflict that emerged out of a very different sort of area of social theory, which in many ways is dominated by Weberian approaches and Marxist approaches, were not being incorporated in these accounts of theories of institutional change. And so what I set out to do in the bargaining approach was to incorporate some of those additional factors that I thought were missing from the transaction cost approach to try to give and it came up with giving a different sense of how, explanation for how institutions emerge. Let me talk about a little bit more about some of the substantive claims of the different approaches. Now, the logic of contracting is, let me start with the transaction cost approach. The logic of contracting has been the source of many explanations of institutional development and change. The underlying thrust of this approach is captured in a nice quote by Threll and Eggertson, where he says, "Changes in contractual forms may often be a long process, particularly when there is a lack of experience with arrangements that would be best suited to a new situation. Once a successful experiment has been made, the forces of competition establish new equilibrium contracts. It is also reasonable to expect that a community that has a very long experience with stable technology and a stable range of relative prices has settled on contractual forms that minimize costs for each branch of production, given the state of knowledge about contractual arrangements and the basic structure of property rights." In order to identify the relationship between the analytical model and the mechanisms of institutional selection invoked in the process of explanation on this account, it is helpful to focus separately on the two main components of the contracting explanation: the individual exchange and the competition over alternatives. Okay. Consider first the contracts produced by individual exchanges. The logic of the exchange relationship is one of mutual benefit. The motivation for the development of the contract is quite simple. When any two social actors perceive that they can achieve benefit from mutual exchange, they must agree on the terms of that exchange. Among those terms are the rules governing the actions of the parties during the course of the exchange relationship. In the context of the general theory, these contracts constitute the social institutions produced by social actors to facilitate the achievement of socially beneficial outcomes. The main mechanism that explains the selection among possible contracts is voluntary agreement. Social actors create these institutional rules because they can achieve benefits which they would not enjoy without them. Hence the importance of the A is greater than B relationship. But the contracts produced by voluntary agreements can take many forms. So the mechanism of voluntary agreement is constrained by an assumption about the kinds of contracts social actors will try to produce. The dominant answer in this literature builds on Coase's early 1960 insights into the effects of transaction costs. That social actors would be concerned about transaction costs is understandable, given the fact that these are the costs incurred in establishing and enforcing institutional rules. The greater the transaction costs involved in an exchange, the lower the level of aggregate benefits enjoyed by the social actors. Now, on the contract approach, once the actors have established the property rights according to a minimization standard, which is so they want to minimize the transaction cost in their contracts. So once they've established the property rights according to the minimization standard, they will maintain them as long as the relevant external circumstances remain stable, according to the theory. But there's always the possibility that some factors external to the exchange relationship will change in such a way as to affect the enjoyment of the benefits of the property. Doug North, who's one of the leading advocates of the transaction cost approach, and was my colleague for a long time, and we actually wrote some articles together on institutional change, even though we have these different theories of how they work. He listed several changes in relative prices which will affect benefits, in the ratio of factor prices, in the cost of information, and in technology. If any of these changes are substantial, then they will affect the relative value of the different ways of institutionalizing property rights. If the result of these changes is that a new property rights scheme would produce greater aggregate benefits than the existing system, the contracting parties will consider the following cost-benefit calculation. Do these additional benefits exceed the costs involved in changing the contract? If the answer is yes, then the actors enter into a new contract, institutionalizing new rights. Note that at this point, this is merely a discussion of the motivations of the actors in an individual exchange. As Eggertson clearly points out, the more sophisticated versions of the transaction cost approach invoke more than the intentions of the actors in an individual exchange to explain the emergence of social institutions. Individual exchanges merely produce the variety of possible institutional forms. The second selection mechanism invoked by the contract approach is competition. Many explanations of institutional development and change situate the decision to establish social institutions in the context of a market or a market-like environment. The main influence of the market on the choice of institutional form rests in the competitive pressure it supposedly exerts on the institutionalization process. Competition can serve as a dynamic selection mechanism which determines the survival of various institutional forms on grounds of reproductive fitness. This is the logic behind the Alkian model of evolutionary competition employed by most economic analyses of institutional emergence. The existence of a large number of firms seeking profits from a common pool of consumers produces pressure for survival. Over time, those firms which employ less efficient techniques will lose profits to those who are more efficient. Losing profits eventually translates into extinction. As the competitive process continues, only those firms which employ efficient techniques will survive. The logic of this dynamic effect forms the basis of the theory of exchange and competition. On this account, competition selects the institutional form that maximizes A1 plus A2. That's the bottom line of this theory, that there's a competitive pressure in the world in which institutions emerge, which forces that kind of institutional form to occur, the one that maximizes the value of A1 plus A2. The invocation of competition as a selection mechanism draws on a particular conception of the social context in which these social interactions take place. It is important to remember that competition is not an either-or phenomenon. There are degrees of competition and therefore degrees of competitive effect. The extent to which competitive pressure will serve as a selection mechanism for efficient institutions depends on the degree to which the social context manifests the requisite empirical conditions under which competition will emerge. Which is to say, if you don't have the right kind of social conditions which produce real competition like they envision in this theory, you're not going to get that type of selection mechanism. The variability of competitive pressure highlights an important feature of the transaction cost approach. It adopts different mechanisms in explaining change for different types of political and economic institutions. For economic institutions, competitive selection is normally invoked as the primary causal mechanism. For political institutions, the competitive selection constraint is often inoperative, as the intentions of the actors serve as the basis for the explanation of change. So let me contrast that with the bargaining theory of bargaining and social conflict. The logic of bargaining has been used as the basis of a number of recent efforts to explain the institutional creation of political and economic institutions. A bargaining approach to institutional emergence and change seeks to explain the emergence of social institutions primarily in terms of the characteristics that distinguish different institutions, different institutional forms. Rather than seeking an explanation of institutional selection in a comparison of the differences between social outcomes in a world of social institutions and those outcomes in a world that lacks social institutions, this approach places primary emphasis on a comparison of the different outcomes induced by the possible institutional alternatives. Given the reliance on an assumption of self-interested behavior as the basis of both of these theories, the main focus of the analysis of institutional differences is the distributional effect of the alternatives. The theory builds its explanation on the distributional relationship highlighted in the basic analytical model, as I've already suggested to you, that in one outcome is distinguished by the fact that A1 is greater than A2, and the other is distinguished by the fact that A2 is greater than A1. So that given a choice of institutions, the first player 1 is going to want to choose the outcome where A1 is greater than A2. Player 2 is going to want to choose where the outcome that A2 is greater than A1. The distributional advantage falls with each of them in one of the two alternatives. On this bargaining account, social institutions are a byproduct of strategic conflict over substantive social outcomes. By this I mean that social actors produce social institutions in the process of seeking distributional advantage in the conflict over substantive benefits. The development of institutional rules is merely a means to this substantive end. The mechanism of selection among the possible institutional alternatives is bargaining competition among the actors over the various alternatives. Institutional development, therefore, is a contest among actors to establish rules which structure outcomes to those social equilibria most favorable for them. As in any bargaining situation, there are some factors that distinguish the actors and thus influence the bargaining outcome in favor of one of the parties. These factors are what we usually refer to when we speak of bargaining power. In a book called Institutions and Social Conflict, I developed a theory that identified the asymmetries of resource ownership in a society as the main factor explaining the resolution of bargaining over social institutions. The main thrust of the argument was that asymmetries in resource ownership affect the willingness of social actors to accept the bargaining demands of other actors. Here, the asymmetries of resource ownership serve as an ex-ante measure of the bargaining power of the actors in a social interaction. In explaining the establishment of particular social institutions, bargaining demands become claims about commitments to particular rules of behavior. The relevant question becomes, what will cause a social actor to accept the commitment of another actor to a particular course of action and thus a particular social outcome? So, put this in terms of the analytical model. In bargaining interactions, the most important resources are those available to the actors in the event that bargaining is either lengthy and costly or ultimately unsuccessful. For any particular bargaining interaction, many factors may determine the availability of these resources. We can think of these as the existing resources which an actor might retain after the efforts to achieve a bargaining breaks down. We try to negotiate and we fail, and you can think about this is what I'm left with if I don't get the benefits of cooperating with you. In the model here, these resources determine the values of B1 and B2 in the model. And B1 and B2 can be interpreted as a measure of the cost of non-coordination on one of the social institutions. If B1 is equal to B2, then the costs are equal, and we can conclude that there are no key resource asymmetries in the social interaction. But if either B1 is greater than B2 or B1 is less than B2, we have an example of an asymmetry in resources and thus asymmetric bargaining power. Here we see an additional analytical relationship which the bargaining approach emphasizes, but which the transaction cost approach does not, the possibility that the B values are not equal. The standard view in bargaining theory is that if A has greater bargaining power than B, A will usually get a greater share of the benefits of the bargaining outcome. We can capture the underlying intuition of this view through the effects of differences in the values of B in this simple model. Here, the mechanisms by which asymmetries of resource ownership influences social outcomes is in its effect on the credibility of the commitments in the bargaining interaction. Consider this example of a two-person interaction. Consider a game in which A1 is greater than A2 in the XX equilibrium, and A2 is greater than A1 in the YY equilibrium. And B1 is greater than B2. Now, the costs of non-coordination are greater for player 2 than for player 1. If player 1 is now able to communicate to player 2 that she will choose X regardless of what 2 does, what will 2 do? That is, what will this information do to 2's choice? So again, player 1 says, I don't care what you're going to do, I'm going to choose X. You now decide. Well, the answer to the question about what 2 will do depends on how credible 2 finds one's commitment to be. But there are important reasons to believe that 2 will accept the credibility of the commitment in this case and respond by choosing X, going along and choosing the social rule, do X, the XX equilibrium. The principal idea here involves the relationship between available resources and attitudes towards risk. Resource ownership influences one's attitudes towards risky situations. There's a positive relationship between ownership of resources and risk acceptance, a negative relationship between ownership and risk aversion. Considered from the perspective of player 2, this relationship suggests 2 related reasons why she would find one's commitment credible and thus choose X. First, since she will suffer fewer costs of failing to coordinate, then she is more likely to accept the risk and attempt the commitment to X. As Maynard Smith put it in his analysis of asymmetric evolutionary games, quote, a player who has less to lose from a breakdown is more likely to risk one. If 2 is aware of the asymmetry, then she has good reason to believe that the first player is sincere in the commitment. Second, since she will suffer greater costs of non-coordination, then she is more likely to be risk-averse and is therefore less likely to challenge number 1's commitment. The risk aversion leads to a willingness to accept the commitment and to choose X. The greater the differences in resources between the actors, the stronger the relationship between costs of non-coordination and risk attitudes should be, presumably. That is, the greater the differential between B1 and B2, then the higher the probability that 2 will choose X. Now, through its emphasis on asymmetries in resource ownership, the bargaining approach grounds its mechanism of rule selection in an important feature of many social interactions. Social actors suffer significant costs for the failure to coordinate on equilibrium outcomes, yet those costs need not be suffered uniformly. When social actors are aware of these differentials, this awareness can influence the credibility of certain strategies. Those who have either fewer alternatives or less beneficial ones will be more inclined to respect the commitment of those who are more powerful and who have more alternatives. In this way, the existence of resource asymmetries in a society can significantly influence the choice of social institutions. Now let me briefly come back, and very briefly, I promise, come back to talk about how the various accounts of neoliberal institutional change fit into these 2 general theories and how they work. As I've said, the 2 theories are grounded in quite different claims about the actual empirical conditions under which social institutions emerge and change. We can see this by turning explicitly to the question of how they would explain the institutional changes associated with the emergence of neoliberalism in Latin America. I'm going to structure the comparison around the following question. Given the initial assumption that the relevant decision makers are motivated by their individual concerns, by their personal concerns, what are the conditions under which the different proposed mechanisms seem most relevant, and thus most plausible as an explanation of the various neoliberal changes? Taking the contract approach first. The contract approach emphasizes the greater efficiency of outcomes induced by social institutions over outcomes that are produced without institutional assistance. Remember, they focus on the voluntary contract and on the pressure of competition. According to the approach, the parties will agree to that contract, which minimizes costs, subject to the constraints on their knowledge and capacities. A transaction cost explanation of neoliberal institutional change will focus initially on 1, the preferences of the relevant social actors, and 2, the efficiency effects of the resulting economic and political institutions. And I'll remind you, throughout the move for neoliberalism in Latin America and in other parts of the world, the constant justification for these types of institutional changes were the greater efficiency that would come, the greater social efficiency that would come from creating neoliberal policies. So here, the central questions from a research perspective are, 1, did the new neoliberal institutions enhance the efficiency of economic and political activity? 2, were there other institutional possibilities that would have had even greater efficiency effects if they'd been established? And 3, were the new neoliberal institutions the ones that were most preferred by all of the relevant economic and political decision makers? Of the explanations of neoliberalism that have been proposed, the shock therapy alternative of Sachs and his associates comes closest to approaching the voluntary contract version of the transaction cost theory. On this account, the argument is that political and economic decision makers preferred those institutions that minimized transaction cost and thus maximized aggregate economic benefits because they thought it was the most efficient way of getting to greater economic growth. From the perspective of individual self-interest, the plausibility of the voluntary selection by contract mechanism is open to question in those situations in which the institutions affect the distribution of benefits. In those cases, rational, self-interested actors will prefer a contract that maximizes their individual benefits over a contract that maximizes aggregate collective benefits. Only in the cases in which one contract satisfies both criteria will the contract mechanism provide an adequate explanation of selection in an institutional choice. Thus, the argument at the level of voluntary contract is most likely to explain the emergence of social institutions under the conditions that A1 is equal to A2. Right? So in those conditions, there are no distributional differences between the different institutional forms, and therefore you'll just go for the one that maximizes the collective benefits. Any claim about the satisfaction of this criteria is called into question by two types of evidence from the Latin American countries. First, there was considerable diversity in the form that the neoliberal institutions took in the different countries. This variety was characterized by significant distributional effects, not only between capitalists and non-capitalists, but also among the capitalists in different economic sectors. While this evidence alone does not undermine the transaction cost approach, it does raise questions about our ability to satisfy the claims that, one, the resulting institutions were the most efficient among the available alternatives, and two, the resulting institutions were the ones most preferred by all relevant decision makers. Second bit of empirical evidence. The changes in both political and economic institutions that resulted from the political demands for relief from the neoliberal reforms were not the most efficient alternatives. Those latter changes clearly cannot be explained by a preference for the transaction cost minimizing alternative. Those changes were redistributive in nature. When there are distributional effects, the second mechanism, competitive selection, serves as the primary source of explanation. The argument here rests on claims about the nature of the social context in which contracts are made. If the conditions of competition exist in a society, then those conditions will have two important and related effects on the selection of institutions. The first is the pressure for survival. Competition selects out those joint activities that fail to maximize A1 plus A2. So there's going to be competitive pressure to choose not the one that's most distributionally favorable to you, but the one that's most collectively favorable to the institution. The second is the effect on the bargaining power of the actors. And this is an important point, another way in which the bargaining approach significantly differs from the competitive selection approach. Competition diminishes the differences in resource ownership among social actors. When the conditions of competition exist, the asymmetries in the levels of resources and opportunities available to the actors, in case an agreeable contract cannot be reached, diminish. In such cases, the bargaining power necessary for an actor to achieve a distributionally favorable contract is absent. Then bargaining over distributional consequences will not adequately explain the selection of institutions, and the contract approach becomes a more plausible explanation of the emergence of social institutions. Therefore, given the assumption in both of these theories that the actors are motivated by their individual concerns more than their collective concerns, the transaction cost approach will best explain institutional emergence when the actual empirical conditions are such that B1 is equal to B2, so that there's no asymmetry in bargaining power in the particular case. In terms of neoliberalism in Latin America, the argument that the economic crisis was so severe that political leaders had no choice but to adopt neoliberal reforms invokes factors consistent with the competitive selection version of the transaction cost argument. And there is evidence to support the idea that international competitive pressure had a role to play in the initiation of neoliberal institutions. Both the decline in export earnings and the unavailability of foreign investment and credit served as constraints on domestic political and economic decision-making. But the latter factor is open to more than one plausible interpretation. While the pressure exerted by international financial organizations can be seen as competitive pressure for foreign resources from the perspective of an individual country vis-a-vis other countries in need of similar resources, the actions of these international organizations can also plausibly be interpreted as strategic initiatives on behalf of various domestic political actors engaged in an international competition for the neoliberal reforms. So there's more than one way of seeing that role that international organizations played. The viability of the transaction cost explanation of neoliberalism in Latin America depends in part on which of these interpretations is deemed more plausible. Combine these questions with evidence of 1, the significant institutional variation across countries, 2, the substantial political conflict throughout Latin America over the nature of the institutional reforms, and 3, the subsequent responses to political pressure after the initial period of neoliberal reform. And there's good reason to conclude that the competitive selection mechanism will not adequately account for the nature of neoliberal institutional change. Let me then say, so that says something about the amount of evidence that's available for the contract theory. What evidence is available in support of the bargaining approach? The argument in support of the bargaining approach suggests that those actors with the higher B values, with the higher asymmetries in resources and the higher bargaining power, will be able to cause the selection of more favorable social institutions. As long as the institution is such that A is greater than B for those actors with the lowest bargaining power, with the lowest B values, an assumption that both approaches share, the bargaining approach provides a plausible mechanism for institutional selection. Given the assumption, again, of individual concerns, the bargaining approach will best explain institutional emergence when the actual empirical conditions are such that A1 is not equal to A2 and B1 is not equal to B2, so that there are differences both in the distributional benefits of cooperation and in the distributional costs of not cooperating. The greater the differences in these values, the more likely it is that the bargaining approach will provide the best explanation of institutional emergence and change. The bargaining explanation of neoliberal institutional change will focus on the preferences of the relevant actors, the distributional consequences of the resulting institutions, and the existence of asymmetries in bargaining power. The primary empirical questions that research in this area would focus on are: 1, did the new neoliberal institutions create significant asymmetries in the distribution of benefits of political and economic interactions? 2nd, did the relevant social actors have conflicting preferences over the possible institutional alternatives? 3, was the process of institutional change characterized by substantial conflict? And 4, did the resulting neoliberal institutions favor those political actors who had an ex-ante advantage in the relevant measure of bargaining power? Did the more powerful people get what they wanted? Several of the proposed explanations of Latin American neoliberal reform invoke either conflicts of interest, political competition, or distributional consequences as important causes of institutional change. The evidence from the Latin American experience demonstrates the importance of these factors and thus lends considerable support to the bargaining approach. A good example of this can be found in the Conahan and Malloy comparative account of the rise of neoliberalism in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru. They argued that the dynamic of neoliberal reform in these countries was primarily a product of the ongoing political competition among domestic capitalists, politicians, and state economic planners. Other accounts emphasize a conflict that includes these actors, but also portrays an important role for labor unions. 2 features of the dynamic of neoliberal institutional change add additional support to the bargaining argument. The first is the aforementioned variety in the form that political and economic institutions took during the rise of neoliberalism. The second is the sudden change in both political and economic institutions that occurred as a response to the political reaction to the initial reforms. Both of these features highlight the importance of the distributional consequences of neoliberal institutions. To the extent that the factors associated with political and economic conflict and the distributional consequences of the resulting institutions can be documented in the Latin American cases, the bargaining approach promises an explanation of aspects of the process of institutional change missing in the efficiency transaction costs account. Finally, in this analysis, I've tried to demonstrate that contrary to much of the criticism of the strategic approach, strategic analyses of political and economic institutions can offer a variety of explanations of institutional change. And the primary causal mechanisms that form the basis of these explanations are often the same ones proposed by other social science accounts that make no explicit mention of any form of strategic decision-making. One of the benefits of these theories is that they can serve as analytical tools for assessing the relative importance of various social factors for processes of institutional change. This follows from the fact that the different theories correlate specific sets of social conditions with particular types of institutions and with particular social mechanisms that generate institutional change. The substantial evidence of political and economic conflict and the existence of distributional differences suggests that bargaining is an important causal mechanism of change in these Latin American countries. But the evidence of the importance of political conflict for explanations of neoliberal institutional change, while lending support to the bargaining approach, does not completely undermine the relevance of the transaction cost theory. For a complete explanation, must take account of the extent to which international pressure constrained the choices of domestic actors. Nonetheless, what the evidence from Latin America does highlight is that the real explanatory power of the transaction cost approach lies in the competitive selection mechanism, and not in the claims about individual contracting in order to minimize transaction costs. Here it is important to emphasize a point that is often lacking in many strategic or rational choice accounts of institutions. Competitive pressure as a selection mechanism is an empirical question, and not an a priori theoretical assumption. So the existence of competition has to be documented and not assumed, as it usually is in these theories. The mechanism-based approach to social explanation is a potentially rich and fruitful one. While the focus is on mechanisms that connect social phenomena to individual level action, the methodology need not be limited to the strategic approach adopted in this paper. But the focus provided by a strategic analysis, such as the one undertaken here, can help to identify how other mechanisms and other methodologies might enter into a comprehensive explanation of the rise of neoliberalism. One further example. Strategic accounts and other rational choice accounts as variants of intentional explanations build on the relationship between the preferences of social actors and the effects of social institutions. But this relationship is a complex one, primarily because institutional choice is a strategic one. As the evidence from Latin America shows, this strategic choice takes place in a context of social, economic, and political conditions that make choice more difficult than that of merely establishing one's most individually preferred alternative. This highlights the importance of paying attention to questions of uncertainty, knowledge, and belief formation as we seek to explain institutional change. When social actors attempt to create and maintain political and economic institutions which will further their own interests and commitments, they often do so with at best an incomplete understanding of the relationship among their preferences, their actions, and the long-term consequences of the social institutions that they have before them as alternatives. These actors will often be disappointed, as the beliefs that they have about the consequences of social institutions will often be mistaken. This fact highlights the importance of identifying the social mechanisms which affect the formation of individual and social beliefs, type 1 mechanisms in the Hedstrom and Svedberg typology. In such cases, the beliefs and preferences on which they base their efforts at institutional change will not match the ultimate effects of those institutions. For those who seek to explain institutional change by invoking the preferences of relevant decision makers, the problem of unintended consequences will always complicate those efforts.
Okay, thank you very much.